Hi, everyone. Good afternoon here on the East Coast. Good morning further west. This is Kathy Bachman with Throtle. I lead product here at Throtle, and I'll be moderating today's webinar with Forrester Research titled The Evolution of Identity Resolution and the Importance to Brands and Marketers. Really excited to see so many joining on the line, and I sense a few others will be continuing to join in the next few moments. I want to introduce today's speakers. Joe Stanhope, who is the Vice President and Principal Analyst at Forrester Research. And we're also joined with Paul Chachko, who's the CEO and founder of Throtle. Joe is a leading expert on the intersection of marketing and technology. His research focuses on a number of areas exploring strategies for leveraging technology. These include enterprise marketing software suites, customer analytics, cross-channel campaign management, and identity management, all to deliver relevant and engaging customer experiences. Paul Chachko has been a formative member of the marketing community for over 30 years. He's credited with being the first to add demographic, behavioral, lifestyle, and geographic data to commercial email marketing. And most recently, he spearheaded the creation of an industry-leading identity resolution and data onboarding company called Throtle. Excited to hear their perspectives today. Let's talk about first what we'll cover, what the purpose of this webinar is, and the things that you can learn about and take away from to apply with your company. So plain and simple, identity matters. If you can't identify and know who your customers are, then you can't create personalized, engaging experiences or leverage that engagement across multiple channels with customers. For brands to remain competitive in this age of the always connected consumer, they have to be able to connect with and understand customers across channels, screens, and devices to close the gap between customer experience and those ever-rising expectations. So these are some of the topics we'll cover today, some of the mechanics of creating customer profiles from silos for a unified view, the importance of using an external validated truth set to fuel accurate identity resolution, how to turn customer identity and intelligence into more revenue and higher marketing performance, and some insights and importance of connecting the dots across screens and touch points with consumers. Throtle is sponsoring today's webinar, and with that, we get a quick shameless plug. So what we do is identity-based data onboarding. We enable brands and others to accurately reach your customers and prospects across screens and devices using very precise identity intelligence about them. We've planted our flag around accuracy while maintaining a scale that marketers need, and really built our business in a different way, offering full transparency, which can include transparent pricing, transparency around our methodology, providing access to IDs and more. We've really built our identity graph at the individual level for greater accuracy and validated all of our data externally against multiple sources, including TransUnion, who is both an investor and a strategic partner in Throtle. So with this, we offer identity resolution, audience intelligence, onboarding or activation, and closed loop insights. So with that quick overview, I'm now going to hand the mic over to Joe Stanhope from Forrester Research, but realizing I left off one important point before we get into the meat of it, we encourage participation from all of you. So this will be an interactive dialogue between Paul and Joe, and we welcome questions from all participants. You can use the chat bar to send me a question, and I will introduce that for discussion. Over to you, Joe.
Well, wonderful. Thanks very much. It's great to be here. Always fascinating to talk about identity resolution and identity topics and get everybody's input and views on the topic. Thanks to Throtle for pulling all this together, inviting me to join. But even more importantly than that, thank you to everybody who's taken time out of their busy days, busy lives, busy jobs to spend a few minutes with Paul and myself and Kathy talking about identity. It means a lot to us, and we're glad you're here. We wanted to start with talking about why identity resolution is important. Why is identity important, and why now? It's a common question because for many marketers, identity is in some ways not new. We've been doing this actually for a great number of years, dozens or decades of years. But how has it changed? And in Forrester's view, we sit in what we call the age of the customer, which is really meant to demarcate a new epoch in the history of business, where the scales have tipped and brands no longer control their relationships with customers. Consumers control their relationships with brands. This has a huge trickle-down effect, of course, on how corporations plan their technology investments, how they engage with customers, how they acquire customers, how they build and deliver products. It's highly impactful to enterprises across the board. But it has a huge impact, of course, on marketing, and it's characterized by two key elements. The first being connectivity. It's not just that everybody has perhaps a mobile phone or a smartphone, an Android or iOS device. It's that consumers use multiple devices multiple times a day in multiple locations. And they are not only interconnected, but these devices are portals, not purposes in and of themselves, but portals to a wide variety of activities for communicating amongst ourselves, communicating with brands, engaging in commerce, engaging in work, doing social media, even messaging, which we don't talk about enough anymore. So a huge range of capabilities happening in many places, many times a day on numerous devices. And this connectivity creates a new essence of how we reach out to and engage with our own customers. And second, in the age of the customer, we have to understand that consumers are not merely empowered by that connectivity, by those devices, but the idea that actually we're very entitled and we have tremendously high expectations for the brands that we do business with. And I would invite anyone in the audience to reflect upon your views and how you engage with brands that you purchase from or engage with, or the brands that you like working with and spending time with. We expect today, generally speaking, that we can get exactly what we want when we want it in our context in that exact moment of need. And when we don't get that, I think we should be honest with ourselves and say that, you know what, we're disappointed when we don't have that great experience with a brand. And sometimes that leads to finding a brand that can give us what we want. And in that context, it tells us one really important thing. It tells us that brands win in customers' moments, understanding that connectivity, understanding that customer relationship and the degree to which the customer has control means that brands and marketers have to not only understand a customer journey, understand where their customers are in that journey, but understand those moments and be ready to engage at that exact time. And what that means really is it comes down to what makes engaging in that moment possible. And for many brands, it's not really a matter of technology, and it's often not even a matter of data per se. So many brands and marketing organizations really have lots of technology, and they've been heavily in the technology to do their work. And they also have a lot of data. Brands are swimming in data that can be used and activated. But operating the moment really requires the ability to recognize customers everywhere, to be able to understand and build a customer profile at an individual level, and to engage really in any touch point, any device in that connected world that the customer desires. And that common thread that goes throughout all of that is identity. And that makes identity strategically critical to brand success, not something that we can make up on the fly, not something to take lightly, but something we should be really planning out, thinking about in advance, and investing in. A sense of customer identity is one of the truly few unique assets that corporations can own and build to set themselves apart from competitors. And it's really more important every single day as customer engagement rapidly evolves and changes on us. So it provides this foundation to keep up with changing consumers, changing technologies, changing devices and attitudes. So in a world of moments, not only beyond identity, but applying identity and using identity to understand how engaging with customers changes. Because we've talked about personalization in marketing for a long time. It's an important watchword. It's something I listen for on a daily basis with Forrester clients. But personalization is changing dramatically. I mean, we mentioned at the top of the hour that Paul was one of the early pioneers in using data and personalizing in email marketing, for example. But it's shifted so much more in a connected, empowered consumer world. And it relies on identity to succeed and be able to personalize in the moment. And it's changing in three ways. One, personalization endpoints continue to expand with the engagement landscape. And this makes sense. I think we can all look at this and say, there's a lot of new devices out there where consumers engage, and by extension would expect to engage with the companies they do business with, right? Engagement effectively happens everywhere. It's not just about email. It's not just about a website. It's not just about being in the store. The evolution of marketing demands that we have the processes, the ability to interact in these devices to match. And this can be challenging. It can be disruptive. I mean, some of these devices have achieved rapid adoption. For example, the voice assistants like an Amazon Alexa really didn't even exist 3 years ago. And now Forrester's data says that we see double-digit adoption across online adults, across all age groups. I mean, the acceleration and adoption of some of these devices in such a short time is really unprecedented. And you can bet that if your customers are using these devices, they expect you to be there too. And so we need identity and identity capabilities to give us the ability to start tying interactions together across these devices, as well as the interaction channels we already use, and to continue to build out that customer profile. Second, the idea of context is changing. Dynamic context really drives powerful personalization, not only scale, but at speed, at the speed of the customer, and at the right level of granularity. Now, historically, I think context has been relatively static or stable. Given the information and the data and the channels we were working with, it didn't change all that often. But in today's world, again, with so many devices, with so much rapid engagement, it becomes very dynamic. Just think about the kind of information we can infer from engagement, the kind of sensors that are available to collect information to help us understand the context of where a customer is at, what they're doing, how they feel about us, what the next move might be. It turns into a world where dynamic context is very powerful. It becomes a trigger. And again, you need the ability to assess identity in a dynamic context world, because it allows you not only to collect these signals of context, but to turn them into insights, to start to make decisions based on those insights, and then rapidly execute interactions in the right places based on what context demands. And finally, the entire concept, the whole paradigm, if you will, of personalization is pivoting and changing. Historically, we've taken a view that we do make a lot of effort in personalization. I'll absolutely tell you that brands have made massive progress in upping their game in terms of how they personalize. But we still put a lot of work. We still force our customers to do a lot of work. And when we call that a cognitive load that we put on customers, it's still really incumbent on you as a consumer to figure out what's happening to you, what your personal contextual situation is, what information you need from a brand, and to figure out how and where and when you're going to get that information. And today, generally speaking, once you show up at the right place to work with a brand, they are ready to present information to you. And certainly that's progress, but given the dynamic nature of context, given these new devices, and if you have the ability to connect it all through identity, brands are learning how to really flip the script and pivot this idea of personalization to reduce cognitive load on customers about 180 degrees. Brands are learning how to understand context on the fly, to predict and understand what kind of content would be helpful to their customer in that situation, and start to determine where, how, and when to present that information to the customer as a moment is happening. This is really the new definition of personalization. It's not just saying, hi, Joe, in an email, thanks for buying product X. Would you like to buy product Y? It's really about this full-fledged dynamic personalization idea based on, of course, the ability to tie it all together, which again goes back to identity.
Great. So as I mentioned, this is going to be an interactive format. For those who joined a little ways in, my name is Kathy Bachman. I'm with Throtle, and we're here with Joe Sanhope from Forrester Research and Paul Chachko, CEO of Throtle. So happy to take questions from the audience. You can just type them into the chat window, and as many as we can get through, we will pose to these fine gentlemen to address. And we've got some already. So first, we were asked foundationally, if, Paul, you could elaborate on the Throtle truth set in terms of what constitutes that, how it's validated, the scale that it's at, and so on.
Sure, thanks. So I'm going to address the truth set, but I'm going to address it in the context of identity in general, not specifically to Throtle. So a truth set is not just a marketing database with a different name. A truth set is a consumer graph, if you will, that has been built over time using multiple sources. And it's not just combining different sources and coming to a distinct group of consumers with specific information. You know, that's seriously just a database. What you really need to do to constitute a validated truth set or a consumer graph in terms of being able to identify a consumer correctly and be able to associate those individual pieces of PII and individual demographic and behavioral attributes to an individual, you really have to go through a process that's very deep, very long, very wide, and very expensive, and generally can't be done by a brand as a single provider in-house. It really needs to be done by a provider out of house. And by validation, what we mean is, as we, the builders of graphs independently, so if you look at the other providers out there and you look at the other DMPs and DSPs, you're assembling a graph using multiple sources, in some cases dozens and dozens of sources. And you're using those sources to validate against each other and come up with a deterministic set of information that is associated to an individual. Those sources can be, you know, postal sources, they can be email sources, they can be mobile ad ID sources, social handle sources, but there are dozens and dozens and dozens of those sources that make up a qualified consumer graph. The validation means you're using a third party to take a look at the data that you have, and they are validating it with their deterministic set. Now, the most often used determining feature is an offline set because it's a very stable set, it's very available, and if you associate the PII from a consumer correctly to that offline set, you'll be able to validate that data. And so from our case, and I think we are pretty unique in this, we use multiple outside sources just from a validation standpoint. So validate that the household addresses that we're using as a key to create an identity and resolve to an identity are accurate, that they're deliverable postal addresses and they're current and they're available. We use other sources to confirm that that individual lives at that particular address, not the household, the address. The third validation we use is somebody to come over to the top, and in our case, it's TransUnion, to provide accuracy and validation that that individual has those specific sets of characteristics on the demographic side, and they live at that household. And once you start validating it, that's where your accuracy comes in, and where you have folks that are providing identity resolution services with single or just limited amount of PII or limited amount of offline data. You're not going to get the same resolution to a deterministic, validated individual that you can market to confidently.
Great, yeah. And thank you, Jason, for that question. I'm sure it was on the minds of many other participants around some of the foundational knowledge of how identity graphs are built, validated, and sustained, given that they are changing constantly. Let's take another question here from Greg, who's interested in any current use cases. So, you know, Paul and Joe talk about some advanced use cases you're seeing of how identity is being used well to create more engaging moments.
Joe, you want me to grab this one?
Sure, go ahead and start. Thanks.
Okay. So, you know, the use cases that we've been seeing are actually quite complex and frankly, you know, illuminating. We've got several different use cases that are utilized across, you know, multiple brands and multiple types of companies. And in one case, we're working with an outdoor provider of advertising services. And if we all understand right now, outdoor advertising is moving aggressively into a programmatic area where you see these billboards flashing different types of ads, you know, across every 5 seconds or what it is. The outdoor providers want to know exactly who the audience is that are passing by those particular billboards. Historically, they've been using census information and demographic information at the location of the billboard to dictate what that audience is going to look like. But as we all know, certainly in well-traveled areas, those billboards are viewed by people that live, you know, far, far away from the billboard. So the engagement of a consumer graph, a validated truth set, allows us to take a look at that particular lat long and determine which MAIDs, using a geographic provider, which MAIDs, mobile ad IDs, are driving by that particular programmatic billboard through what day parts and time parts. having a validated truth set that's complete, that has that provider to give that outdoor service provider the ability to say, this is the profile of the people who are driving by that billboard by using, the geographic locations of a maid, and be able to provide that profile, which is going to be different by day part. So in the morning, it might be a certain customer, by midday, it's a different customer, and by end of day, it's the same person as driving by in the morning because they're commuting. Another use case, having a fully baked PII-based truth set, you're able to help brands identify existing customers by type. So for the instance of a credit card company, you can provide an identification of what consumers are visiting what websites that's tagged by credit card ownership, and be able to drive dynamic content to that particular person based on the type of card they own with that particular bank. The other thing you can do is take a look at the anonymous visitors, and based on the anonymity of that person and knowing that they are not a customer, you can drive other content and provide offers to become a bank card holder. So the use of an ID graph, a validated truth set, are becoming more and more complex, and at the speed of which you're able to do this identification and return identification back to the website allows for dynamic distribution of content in a pretty open area. So you're able to do this across multiple different web properties, multiple different partnerships, and the use cases just continue to grow.
Yeah, there's the use cases in some ways are in the eye of the beholder. There's literally hundreds of them, Paul. And everyone has sometimes a different starting point to initiate this journey, and certainly we are seeing them become more advanced, just like some of the out-of-home and the advertising, starting to see things in television as well, addressable TV. A lot of clients start in on it either from the insights direction, where they want to do some of the basic things like suppression or frequency capping across channels, or even slightly more advanced, getting to a stronger sense of attribution across channels. And then on the branding side, a huge push on personalization, getting timely, more granular information available to activate on, to personalize experiences in microsegments or at the individual level is very common, or tying together cross-channel journeys for customers and being able to activate based on that.
Great. So in the interest of time, I think we should move on. We've got a few sections of content where I should have said this at the beginning, so I apologize. We'll share some ideas and insights in each section, and then do a little Q&A and discussion. So participants can enter into the chat box a question at any point, and when we get to the next dialogue, we'll try to introduce it. Let's continue on, Joe, with identity resolution.
Sure. I think it's prudent to, at this point, talk about how do we define this and think about the broader concept. Identity resolution, I think, is sort of an umbrella topic, and at Forrester we categorize various flavors or variants or categories of identity resolution. But let's talk about the semantics just a bit. We use the term at Forrester identity resolution very intentfully. We decided purposely not just to call it, say, identity or identity management, although I think those are subtopics. I think that it's important to think about identity as being more than just taking a pile of identifiers maybe and storing them in a single place. Like Paul said, it's more than a database necessarily. And the starting point for really understanding it for the people that I tend to work with is understanding that identity is not binary. We historically, especially if I came out of more of the direct marketing industry, so I tend to think about the world in terms initially, at the start as kind of a first party PII based known customer world. And oftentimes we tend to look at it as either we know an individual or we don't, right? It's on or it's off, it's binary, it's a 1 or a 0. And that can be a mistake, because in today's multi-channel, digital and offline, complicated world, there's actually many different variations of what identity can mean, depending on where a customer is in that life cycle. When we are doing acquisition and we first engage with a customer or a prospective customer for the very first time, we know a very different amount of information, different resolution of that information than we do, say, when we've had a very long-term trusted relationship with a customer over time. So we have to start thinking about identity not as a singular golden record type of concept, but as actually a continuum. And that's okay, because different levels on this continuum match up to different areas and different spots on that customer life cycle and your customer journey, where you know different levels about your customer. But it also maps to different use cases. Paul and I were talking about different applications of identity. Those vary wildly in what kind of information, what kind of a customer profile, what a graph might look like for applying information usefully in those use cases. And they exist on this continuum. Right. So rather than look at this academically perfect idea of identity, we have to build identity to match essentially how you want to apply it. It's a far more practical way of looking at it. We also have to understand that identity is not a one-off. It's not a one project and you build it. I think, at Throtle, they spend vast amounts of time continuously understanding and building their resources around identity, right? And that's because identity doesn't age well. It's constantly changing in this age of the customer. And so I break identity kind of down into a four-step high-level process where, yeah, we are collecting ways to identify a customer from many different sources, like Paul mentioned. We use various techniques as appropriate to tie these keys together and start understanding and building an identity graph across those identifiers. But again, just having a sense of identity is not enough, right? The whole purpose for this is to activate it and to use it to engage with customers. And so we've got to take the process further. And that gets us into building a profile based on identity, understanding what's going on with that customer, not just who that customer is, and then making that information available so it can be used by technologies and different systems and activation partners, so we can apply identities to insights and engagement use cases, as we've been discussing. We also have to really think about how we're going to manage a highly dynamic world of customer identity. It's changing constantly every few milliseconds. So you change a preference, you get a new device, you move to a new home, you buy a different car, whatever it is. New information is constantly presenting itself, coming on and coming off of a profile or an identity graph. So we have to be thinking about, how do we collect information? How do we connect it? Once we have that profile, we have to be ready to actively manage it. We're adding new data. Sometimes we're taking data off. Right? Maybe you want to opt out. Maybe data expires. Maybe you get a new data provider and information has to come out of profiles. We also have to do sometimes what I would call kind of the ugly but really important work of literally managing data. How do you deduplicate information? What level of resolution does that data have to be presented in? Data hygiene, data management tasks to make sure the quality of that data remains high and accurate. We have to prepare to distribute information to those systems for activation. What format does it have to be anonymized or hashed? What kind of technical connectivity is required to extract and move that data, that identity graph around? And how are we going to apply it?
Great topic for discussion in terms of identity resolution. I love the continuum that you used a couple slides ago, Joe, referencing how people's identity can go from completely anonymous to verified, validated, and known. Question from the audience around, the confusion. Well, it's really a statement and a question that it's confusing for marketers to understand the landscape of identity providers because there are so many companies talking about having identity graphs, but also recognition that those identity graphs come in many flavors along a continuum of partial to complete, less or more accurate. What guidance do you, Joe, or Paul have on helping marketers understand this landscape of providers?
Yeah, I'll grab that, Joe, to start. So, looking at an ID graph provider and outsourcing your work to an ID provider is similar to what we saw, back in the world of email marketing and postal marketing, a decade ago, 2 decades ago, is that there's an evolution. And right now there's a lot of people fighting for their space within the ability to resolve to an individual. The thing that you have to do is do a lot of question and research in terms of, how are they building their graph? How are they keeping it active? How did they construct the graph? And for the way the world is right now and the way, digital marketing has been moving, an individually based graph is the only way to look at this. And you can't really resolve correctly if you're working with a graph that has been built off of a household database or a partial database. So you see a lot of providers providing, identity resolution based on one particular, point of PII. And, my advice is, look for those providers that have a full graph, that update it frequently, that go through everything that Joe's talked about in terms of being able to, hygiene that file correctly. I mean, these are living and breathing assets. These are not stagnant assets. Every single day, you've got to include, changes to that graph of people moving, passing away, or people getting new devices, or, anything that's changing over time has to be built into that graph. So the questions that should be asked to folks are, how are you keeping up with the changes? How often do you update the graph? How many sources do you have contributing to the graph? Have you built it from the bottom up? Those are things that are just basic, building blocks to, choosing somebody to help you with identity resolution. And you have to look at whether or not they're collecting PII or non-PII. I mean, some folks are claiming to be, ID resolution people, but they're not collecting PII. And that's a foundational way of validating an individual, and it's a foundational way of being able to match to an individual. So, there's multiple pieces of information that you need to gather in order to make the correct choice. But, out of the box, you've got to look at somebody that's spending time and money and effort on this on a full-time basis. It's not an afterthought, and it's not a short-sighted thought. This is, a piece of what their DNA is as a company.
I'd agree with that. It's fair to say there's a lot of different kinds of identity resolution providers, which shouldn't be too surprising because there's a spectrum of how identity resolution gets applied. The challenge is, of course, that there's a lot of them. They're coming at it from different directions, and there are only so many words in the English language to describe all of this, right? And that's where it gets very confusing, is when you're hearing the same words that may describe very different things at the end of the day. And so it hasn't always been easy at Forrester. We've tried to demarcate the broader identity resolution landscape with a variety of categories. For the buyer side, the most important thing you can do is understand literally the use cases. What kind of insights do you need to generate about your customers? How do you want to engage with your customers? Where are those happening and where in the customer life cycle? And that determines essentially the level of identity that you need. And that allows you to focus on the right categories, the right types of identity resolution providers that can support those specific use cases. And then, of course, you get into, are they building it the right way? Is it accurate and scalable, and all the important things that Paul mentioned, understanding that the quality, right, and suitability of that specific type of supplier to support your needs.
Great, yeah, great responses, and thanks to participants for submitting your excellent questions. Let's keep moving along to our next section around challenges. And again, if you have questions as we go, just type them into the chat bar.
Yeah, nobody ever said this was going to be easy. It is hard. There have been some long established methods of doing this in more siloed ways, on a per channel basis or a per tactic basis or in ad hoc ways. As we mentioned earlier, identity is certainly nothing new to marketers. It just continues to get more complex, and historically, I think marketers, as they try to advance their capabilities, because it's not a mystery that we should get better at this, and we want to do more of it, and we want to use it more broadly, is you run into some legitimate challenges that do make this hard, make it difficult to do out of the box, and of course ups the ante on, as Paul was talking about, how you qualify the partners that you might work with to solve these challenges and take advantage of the opportunities. The first big challenge is that historically, I think marketers have been forced to make a choice between accuracy and scale, and there's been a perception that you couldn't have both, or it was very, very difficult. And so marketers are trying to figure out, do I go with something that's perhaps, and I don't want to get into a whole lot of technical talk about deterministic and probabilistic capabilities and techniques for doing identity resolution, but do we do more precision type matching, like deterministic type capabilities, to achieve the maximum level of accuracy? And that supports, again, certain use cases, certain ways of engaging with customers, and depends on a certain level of data and capability. But that doesn't always scale up the way a brand would want to move the needle in their marketing programs. Or do we need to go with something that's a little bit more maybe model, a little bit, as the analysts might say, based on something fuzzier or probabilistic, where we can achieve tremendous scale, but there are significant trade-offs there because it's not going to be as granular or precise or accurate, right? And so this might be more suited to certain kinds of campaigns, certain kinds of capabilities and customer engagement, but it doesn't give us oftentimes the kind of personalization granularity that marketers are really trying to evolve to. And so they've had to make choices between this. They have to find that middle ground where the trade-offs are, what they're willing to give up, and what's really important to them. On average, because of technology advances, data advances, and of course the priorities of brands, we see a general movement towards prioritizing accuracy and quality over pure scale and reach. But it's a long road to make that kind of a shift, and certainly there's always trade-offs to any kind of a choice like this, and that can be hard to work through, and it takes time. Second is that the great thing about being a marketer today is there's so many different tools, so many different channels, touch points, and devices to engage with customers. Any real marketer relishes having the opportunity to engage more with their customers in more places and at more times. The trade-off, the downside of that is that identity fragments rather than comes together. It switches off, and we have so many different ways to identify a customer. Everything throws off some kind of trail or identity capability. The problem is it exists in a great many places, and it's not that there's so many of them or it's happening so quickly. It's that it's an apples to oranges to mangoes argument. Many of these identifiers are fundamentally different from each other and then hard to rationalize and connect. They might represent individuals or households or addresses or devices. They might have very strong privacy requirements. Some of them are virtually public information. Some of them are updated all the time. Some of them are very stable and static. The fundamental characteristics of so many of these identifiers are radically different. And that makes it hard to make that connection, to build that identity graph and to build that profile when you're dealing with very different kind of ways to identify a customer over time. And finally, we have fragmented or created silos of customer journeys. If a fundamental idea of identity is to bring information together, build a singular profile, identify a customer everywhere, brands, generally speaking, have built huge technology stacks and data stacks that tend to be specialized by parts of the customer journey. It's not unusual at all for brands to have a separate set of technology and data to accommodate their mobile engagement, their offline engagement, and their digital engagement. And these systems may communicate with each other. They may share some information, but highly variable and at different levels and different degrees. So we've actually created fragments in our own technology and data capabilities within brands, and that makes it hard also to pull together because each one of these systems, each one of the tools within these categories in the tech stack contains its own slice or a little bit of customer identity and of the customer profile. And again, we have to get that out of these systems so we can start connecting them and creating some kind of a proxy for integration across those.
Great. So on this topic of challenges, I'm sure that some of the marketers on the line have their own challenges to share that perhaps Joe and Paul can weigh in on. One of the first questions dives further into this potential challenge of accuracy versus scale, and the question is, how important is deterministic matching in the end, and can you ultimately achieve scale?
Yeah, Joe, I'll jump in here for a second. You know, when you start thinking about deterministic matches, you know, everybody kind of goes to the Google and the Facebooks of the world, and now Amazon. And you know, as I start thinking through that, you know, that walled garden and matching into those ecosystems, you know, it's not 100% deterministic. We all share devices, we all share computers, so the associations that even the walled gardens have isn't 100% deterministic. Perspective. You know, the science of identifying an individual down to a deterministic level is being improved day over day. And, you know, as we've mentioned throughout this call, you know, it is in the science of taking a disparate set of data providers and doing a lot with that to resolve down to the ownership of that PII correctly and utilizing those various PIIs that everybody has as an individual and be able to continue that association. So as somebody comes into your business to say, we need help resolving to this particular individual and identifying them accurately and then reaching them. If you're maintaining an individual-based graph and the provider is really working hard to do that and is transparent about what they're doing, you know, you can start achieving scale. It is not, you know, a 30% sum game. You can get to 50-60% of deterministic matching, you know, with any given file from a brand or a customer. One of the things that helps doing that is something that's starting to permeate the industry right now in terms of being able to reach a consumer deterministically online across multiple devices and platforms. And that is making sure that the data you receive first from the brand or the data provider is accurate. And you'd be surprised how often the data, whether it's coming from a CRM system, coming from some sort of disparate system, POS, wherever it is not accurate. There's not a lot of noise wrapped around that. And if your identity resolution provider and data onboarder are not doing the appropriate work in advance of actually activating that data to identify the individual deterministically beforehand, then you are going to end up with a host of accuracy problems and a lot more probabilistic data than you are with deterministic data.
Great. Let's hit one more from the audience, from Mark. What are the right metrics that businesses should use to understand efficacy as they evaluate across identity resolution providers? Joe or Paul, either one of you?
You want me to grab it, Joe?
Yeah,
Go
that's
ahead.
also a fantastic segue into the next section where we're going to be talking about measurement. So the question was, what metrics do you look at?
What metrics to evaluate the efficacy across providers?
Yeah, so when you start looking at different providers who are providing you with the capabilities of resolution, the first thing is, from our standpoint, is transparency. You have to be able to provide the data back to the data owner so they can do their own work on their side to prove that your matching algorithms and capabilities are coming up correctly. The other thing is you also have to be able to take a disparate set of data from the data provider to your truth set and be able to accurately look at the different linkages and be able to say that, if a data set coming in has, one or two linkages or zero linkages, you can resolve that person accurately by using other pieces of the data that they collect. So, from a data efficacy standpoint, there's providers that can't work with PII. There's providers that can't work with certain, types of linkages. So the best thing to do is take a look at a provider that has a full set of data and capabilities that can really resolve any data set to an individual accurately without the burden of not being able to look at one small piece of data and get to a resolution.
Great, and it sounds like, yep, that was a good segue right into measurement, Joe.
Yeah, perfect. Measurement's a really important topic, actually, and I don't think it actually gets enough discussion. Although I do believe it's coming up more and more as users and buyers mature and as they pursue more sophisticated use cases like we've been talking about. This is something that's really coming along really rapidly, but it makes sense that this would come up because, like any situation where you're investing time, money, and resources, i.e. resolution or otherwise, those efforts should be measured, and proven to show a return and optimized over time. So measuring the evaluation of ID resolution processes is variable. Understanding the core data set, like Paul was talking about, is certainly important. But you have to kind of look at, again, which identities are you resolving and how is it being applied to understand, specifically how you might measure it. I've got a couple examples here to kind of illustrate the way some of these differences would work. What you will see is that, popularly speaking, match rates are kind of the #1 thing that we tend to lean on. But I think measurement is much broader than just match rates. And I'm sure Paul would agree with this. And so I think the real takeaway here is going to be understanding that you can start with trying to understand match rates, and match rates, whenever you're dealing with data, is part and parcel of measuring it. But there's a much bigger world of measurement and understanding efficacy than pure matches. So if we look at, for example, in onboarding, a traditional standard customer data onboarding process, for the sake of essentially efficiency today, there's 3 main phases of operation that we see in onboarding, right? Upload, anonymize, and match. So we can think about in terms of the upload phase, right? Is the inbound data that the brand creates for their onboarding supplier, is that data accurate? Hasn't been updated? Has it gone through a hygiene process? Is it complete? from a data perspective. And by the time we get to the anonymize phase of onboarding, where you're hashing the data, for example, is that process correct to the vendor specifications? Is it running, in the right time period, based on the right data sets? Is it handled accurately and in a timely manner? And finally, the oft mentioned matching phase, so that as the onboarder picks up that data and goes to work on it, what are those match rates? But beyond that, understanding how accurate are those matches? Are the match rates changing over their time? And of course, going multiple levels below that, as we talked about previously here, is understanding what are those matches based on, right? What's that data set or reference sets that go along with crafting those matches and the matching techniques. An alternate view, based on a different variant of identity resolution, would be activating data, right? Perhaps even after a onboarding process, activating audiences for digital media. And this is the first port of call in a great many identity processes. And again, match rate is heavily emphasized here. But in digital media, partners don't operate in isolation. The really critical part to think about, I believe, is not looking at match rates on individual suppliers, but matching across suppliers, because in that supply chain of digital marketing, you've actually got a daisy chain of suppliers that are working together to connect an initial set of information to the delivery of an ad to some individual. So you really need to look at that full process, right? So again, this is simplified for illustrative purposes, but taking first-party data, understanding how perhaps a DMP matches to that, and then understanding how that translates once that data hits an activation platform, perhaps a DSP or ad server, whatever it might be, and understanding the trickle-down effect and that daisy chain effect of matching across multiple vendors, not at individual vendors. So it's really important to think about the longer-term implications of what that means. It does make things more complicated, admittedly, because now you're not just looking at an individual vendor, you're having to look at the whole thing. It can make testing and evaluating vendors a little bit more time-consuming because it requires a broader process. But of course, it's well worth it to fully understand what's really happening and what your options are. Now, beyond match rates, because it gets so much emphasis, it's certainly useful and important, but it's not the only way I recommend that people track and evaluate identity resolution. I think it's important to think about addressability, which builds on match rates, and it's a measure really of assessing the number of consumers you can actually contact, right? And I think this one's really important because it actually defines your marketing universe. Accuracy, probably the most important one here. It's coming up more and more with customers who are getting more sophisticated. And I think it's important to understand, are you reaching the people that you intend to? And again, depending on the use cases, depending on the location of this data and how it's being used, is it digital, is it offline? Are we talking about known PII customers? Are we talking about devices? Actually creating processes that test and measure the accuracy of targeting and delivery of this data beyond a match rate. Understanding persistence. If a fundamental goal of marketers is to engage with a consumer across devices and channels over time in a longitudinal manner, then having robust, long-lasting customer profiles is very important. And so robustness, meaning that if a bit of data changes, if a cookie expires, if they change a phone number, for example, it doesn't break the continuity of that customer profile or that identity graph. That's persistence. And so we're seeing customers actually measure literally in days the average level of persistence of their identifiers and their identity graphs for profiles, so that they know that they can reach their customers over time, no matter how this identity graph gets updated and changes and shifts over time, because it certainly will. And then of course the proof is in the putting experiments to validate lift provided by identity resolution, to validate that it supports improved marketing performance.
In the interest of time, let's go on to the next section, and then we'll wrap with final Q&A.
Absolutely. So there's a lot happening in identity resolution, and it's enormously important. It's not something you can make up on the fly, and it's not something that should be seen as an ad hoc process. We tend to think about it today as being associated with specific marketing tactics or marketing channels or specific ways in which we promote to customers, right? You know, we already talked about digital media, for example. So we want to take customers, we turn those into audiences, and we might do something like display advertising or retargeting. There's nothing wrong with this at all. It's really important. It generates great results. It's a tremendous benefit to brands and marketers. But identity resolution can be so much more, and the ways in which you do identity resolution actually roll up into a larger context. So one of the real takeaways here is, I think, talking about identity resolution in a bigger way, about more than targeting, thinking about going beyond tactical targeting or channel-specific use cases to really enable elements like improving measurement capabilities and personalization capabilities. And this does take some planning. Again, you're going to build identity and adapt identity and improve and optimize your sense of identity for your customers over time. It is necessarily something that you mature into, you invest in it over time, you develop expertise, you get the right suppliers to do that work and to support your efforts there. So I talk to clients a lot about developing literally a roadmap, just like I would consult with them on creating a roadmap for their marketing technology investments, creating a roadmap for your identity resolution capabilities. And as always, I break it down into a categorical set of use cases, targeting, measurement, and personalization, and the use cases within those, and thinking about what are you doing today in identity resolution, and again, what kind of insights, what kind of engagement do you want to do in the future? Where do you want to engage with customers in the future? And this sort of starts to determine your future requirements for identity resolution, right? What does that identity graph have to connect to in terms of channels and touch points and devices? What kind of a customer profile are you going to need to build those insights, to generate the right models, to supply, say, an artificial intelligence model or machine learning system with the right kind of data to generate the right creative elements? So planning out your future needs over time, and then literally putting a plan in place to align the people, the suppliers, the financial investments it's going to take to make the delivery, the identity capabilities to deliver those use cases a reality, and having that built out, having it designed and planned, and having it ratified internally by the right stakeholders. And as Paul's talked about, 99% of the time, this involves working with partners. We do have clients that will do internal proof of concepts or pilots to validate certain identity resolution concepts as being valuable and accretive to performance. But in terms of maturity, really, every customer that we work with at Forrester reaches a point where, to create a certain level of scale, of reach, of quality, they need to work with a partner, a firm that specializes in identity resolution in the right way to support these use cases. And so you will be looking at this, and so always be thinking about selecting solutions that meet your needs. And a lot of times we certainly talk about concepts like scalability, and we talk about concepts like precision or accuracy, and you have to have those to support your proper use cases. And there are ways to look at the data and ask the right questions of a supplier about where does your data come from, how do you build it, is it transparent? But I also talk to clients about making sure that the solutions, the suppliers they work with, have productized and portable solutions as well. And by productization, what we mean is a supplier investing explicitly in identity resolution solutions? This shows a level of commitment, of ongoing investment to support your needs with specific products that support identity resolution. Because there's a lot of capabilities for identity out there in the market today, but they are embedded in products that do different things. And I would strongly encourage you to think about looking for specialty identity resolution products that are not something that tags along with another offering, or not something that's embedded in another offering. Look for specialty options, because they're going to be the most precise, they're going to be the most scalable. In terms of portability, if you're building this asset of a customer profile, of a customer identity graph, you're going to want to use it as often and as broadly as possible. Perhaps not immediately, but you're going to build on it to support use cases in the future with your roadmap. It might even go beyond marketing into broader CX initiatives, even IT initiatives. Once you're building an identity asset, it is a capability for your corporation, your company, to use broadly and to create consistency and continuity across everything you do. So you want to work with a solution and providers that can support a level of portability where that identity graph, the key identifiers, elements of the customer profile can be made available to these other systems more broadly to fully leverage that asset.
Teeing up some great topics. and we have some questions. We unfortunately don't have the time to answer each and every one. Paul, I'm sure, is happy to follow up with responses individually. Joe can say for himself if that's an option. In the final minutes, would be great to just get points of view, maybe starting with you, Paul.
Sure.
Based on today's topics. What are the top 3 takeaways that you would like our participants to take back to their companies?
Sure. So before I get to those takeaways, hey, Joe, I just wanted to thank you for just an amazing presentation. You seem to make the complex very simple. So thank you, and you certainly show yourself as an expert in this subject matter. So it's undeniable how good you did today. Regarding the takeaways, I mean, I have 3 major kind of categories. I mean, the first one I think is flexibility. As customers continue to, increase their expectations from brands, and, they're demanding more, and as capabilities and solutions continue to improve and change, and new things are being added all the time, I think, the flexibility of an identity resolution provider is really important, and somebody who can actually change with you as time goes on and isn't so stuck in their ways and aren't going to stay stagnant. So I think, flexibility of a provider is really important. I think the second takeaway, and I hope everybody kind of understood, you can't do this alone. The idea of being able to do identity resolution in-house with limited resources, limited budgets, limited assets, limited capabilities, as fast as everything changes and as broad as everything is, I think is probably an unwise decision. So, you really need to find a partner. You need to find somebody who's an expert at this and can really link with you on a one-to-one basis in terms of being able to provide you with the resolution. And the third thing, and I think, quite frankly, probably the most important, is accuracy. In this day and age where you're trying to get your offers in front of the exact person that's your customer, there really isn't any room for inaccurate data and processes that kind of skip the proper steps to resolve to the proper individual. And if you look at the accuracy, that drives obviously the results in measurement, and your measurement obviously becomes a lot more glued to the ground and actionable, as well as being able to build lookalike audiences on an accurate basis. So, flexibility, find a good partner and make sure your resolution is accurate down to the individual basis.
Great. Joe, any final concluding comments?
Well, I agree with all of those. I think those are superb recommendations. My big takeaways perhaps build on that. I think, one, understanding identity is strategic to how you run your business, how you engage with your customers, and it's not possible to underestimate how important it is, that it needs to be planned out, that it needs to be done intentionally, and it just has to be taken seriously as a strategic initiative. Second, I would say measure it, and it's about more than a match rate. Optimize it over time, build it over time, hold suppliers accountable, hold yourself accountable, measure and build it. And then finally, don't treat identity as a monolithic singular concept. Treat it as something you're building for your organization. Treat it as an asset that you're building for your organization, and align it with how you're going to apply it. Always start with those use cases, as opposed to pursuing some kind of a academic ideal or golden record. Make sure it applies to your business, and it helps you build your business the way it needs to be handled.
Great. Thank you, Joe and Paul, and thank you all for attending. If there are any other questions, we're happy to answer them here from the Throtle team. You can email us at hello@throtle.io. And yep, it's with 1 T. Thanks again. Have a great day.